Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico 33, Beyond New Mexico. From Spanish Government in New Mexico, quote, "In the past, there has been an unfortunate tendency on the part of scholars to consider New Mexico as essentially isolated from the main current of events transporting New Spain. There is obviously some logic in steering such a course, given the province's geographical remoteness, but carried to an extreme, it ultimately may cause the historian's ship to founder." End quote. Simmons continues, quote, "Review of the entire subject of the local economy, taking these and other points into consideration, may reveal that some of the early writers, such as Pedro Batista Pino, exaggerated or distorted the picture of conditions prevailing in New Mexico in an effort to win concessions from the Spanish government." End quote. We've talked about many things regarding late colonial New Mexico. We're going to continue these conversations with how New Mexico physically connected itself to the greater Spanish Empire. We've already talked about the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which connected Mexico City to Santa Fe. Today we'll continue by talking about the various explorations that would lay the path for the Old Spanish Trail. The Old Spanish Trail is a trail that linked California to New Mexico. In some ways, the Old Spanish Trail is an extension of the Camino Real via Santa Fe, and it being one of the jumping off points for the various routes that this trail would take to California. The Old Spanish Trail was, like many trade routes in New Mexico, predated by indigenous trails. First came to the Spanish's attention when Ute guides led them to the Great Salt Lake. The beginnings of the trail date back to Coronado. If you remember, he sent an expedition to find the Gulf of California. Meanwhile, Rodrigo Cabrillo explored California, the other end of the trail. In the 1600s, a new word entered the Spanish lexicon, Togallo. It referred to the Great Salt Lakes, where the caves that the Aztecs claimed to come from were thought to be near. But like Quivira, the exact location is debated beyond it being somewhere northwest of New Mexico. The earliest mentions of Togallo appear in 1678 via Diego de Penalosa's map. Actual knowledge of the Utes may have dated back to a meeting between Oñate and some Quivirans. It would be a while, though, before the frontiersmen started moving into that northwesternly direction and to have more close encounters with the Utes. Togallo would draw explorers, much like Quivira had. For most of the 1600s, the Spanish focus was on the plains, though, rather than on the western part of what would become the American Southwest. By the mid-1600s, though, the Utes had begun to come trade with the Pueblos and Spanish. Some Spaniards began to conflate Togallo with Copala of the Aztec tradition and thought there should be wealth there. By the mid-1600s, though, the Utes had begun to come trade with the Pueblos and Spanish. Some Spaniards began to conflate Togallo with the Copala of the Aztec creation story and thought that there should be wealth there. Around 1711, the Spanish would start to be more interested in the region northwest of New Mexico. Trade with the Utes took place across much of Utah and Colorado, stretching as far east as Walsenburg, Colorado. There were attempts at official expeditions into the region, but they were often denied by the Spanish crown. Togallo was described as a place with people of many different languages, implying it was part of a larger slave trade. Sonoran Spaniards were also interested in getting in on this trade. New Mexico in the 1700s, as we've talked about, was hampered by raids and conflict on the New Mexican frontier. In the 1730s, Abiquiu and Ojo Caliente were settled and would become key points along the Old Spanish Trail, as would Tierra Amarilla in the 1830s. Even the Franciscans would be interested in the potential such a route would have. The first official expedition was that of Juan Maria Antonio Rivera in 1765 to the Colorado River. This drew more interest to the potential of a route to California. And in 1776, the Franciscans proposed to establish a route between Santa Fe and Monterey. This expedition would fail to make it to California, though. They would visit Utah Lake, and they heard of the Great Salt Lake. They also noted the sizable population in the area around Utah Lake. Utah Territory, that is, with a Y, would be defined as a result of the Dominguez Escalante expedition, as from the Grand Canyon to the ridge of the Great Basin. Interest in trying to establish a route between these two areas would wane, though. Overall, the development of the Old Spanish Trail was more organic, as Spanish traders exchanged information on how to meet and trade with the Utes. By 1830, the route had been established. It went from Santa Fe to Abiquiu, past Tierra Amarilla, to the Rio San Juan near Kanab, to Las Vegas, and then on to Los Angeles. There were a handful of other routes to other locations along the way as well, depending on where specifically the trader or traveler was trying to get to. New Mexicans liked to trade and often ignored Spanish laws prohibiting trade against the Utes. Spanish Indian policy is often considered quote-unquote peaceful for settled tribes, and hostile towards semi-nomadic tribes were considered warlike by the Spanish. This distinction was never simple, as there was regular trade between groups. Pretty much from the start, the Spanish would start to get involved with the slave trade present in the Southwest and on the plains. While the Pueblo Revolt was a stark reminder that the Spanish hold on New Mexico was tenuous at best, The Spanish had always been more concerned about raids coming from the east. After the revolt, that fear got even worse, and avoiding a long war became the main goal of Spanish policy with the indigenous nations that bordered New Mexico. Trade fairs were the only authorized time to trade with Plains tribes, but limiting it to this was difficult. Captives and goods were exchanged at these fairs, and in 1749, Governor Cachupin tried to establish lasting peace and establish ties with the Utes. He did this through negotiations, including an agreement that the Utes would punish warriors who stole Spanish livestock, which seems to have worked to some degree. There were some setbacks overall, but he was able to negotiate a somewhat peaceful relations, but subsequent governors would burn a lot of those bridges, just like we saw with the Comanches. In 1762, when he returned, Cachupin would work to restore those relations. His successor, Pedro Fermin de Mendinueta, also worked to dismantle this peace. During this time, as we've talked about a lot, war with the Comanches would break out again, and that would push the Utes to the San Juan Mountains in northern New Mexico. Mendinueta and Cachupin were two of the most important individuals for creating the path that would become the Old Spanish Trail. Cachupin may have directly had a hand in what led to the Rivera expeditions. The first Rivera expedition embarked in June 1765 and started over a traded piece of silver. It met with little success. It appears that Rivera did not include the first part of his route in his official report. Some scholars think that the Spanish were trying to keep the overall route a secret from other colonial powers. But as many personnel on the expedition were already familiar with these early steps in the route, it also implies that an unofficial trade was already present with the Utes, and that the Spanish didn't see a need to copy down an already known part of the route. They left Abiquiu and they followed the Chama River to Chimney Rock. From there they would continue onwards, eventually arriving at the Animas River. They started to encounter Ute rancherias and tried to hunt down the Utes who had traded the silver. Here they learned about some other silver deposits in the region. They tried to find these other deposits, but found little silver that was worth settling for. They continued trying to find the first Ute that had traded some silver to a Spaniard, who may have been living among the Payuchi. They were told that this Ute had returned home far away, and the Spanish would have trouble making it to his home. Another excuse they heard was that it was the wrong time of year to go to his home. However, despite these excuses and setbacks, eventually they found him and he agreed to show them the silver deposits in exchange for a horse. They were then led to these deposits. Again, though, they were forced to leave without too many gains, though, as they had not brought the right tools to survey the silver deposits. They then returned to New Mexico, planning for a second expedition. In autumn of 1765, Rivera was sent out again on this second expedition. He was tasked to ingratiate himself with the Payuchis and to be shown a path to the Rio del Tizon. He was also to look for large towns, something the Spanish were always looking for whenever they undertook any expeditions into new territory. He was to carry trade goods and claim to be on a trade mission if he met other Europeans. They met the Payuchis at the same settlements that they had found before. The Utes seemed to have known about the Spanish' intent and demurred from taking them anywhere specific. They did get a guide, though, eventually, who helped them move east, and it looks like they mostly paid their guides with horses during these expeditions. When they reached the Uncompetech Plateau, they met a Tepehuachi hunter. They reached the Rio del Tizon River, but Rivera was skeptical that it was actually the river. They continued on for a bit despite their guide's reservations. They stayed with the Saguana. In late October, they turned around from explorers, traders, and slavers. Quote, "It seems that Spanish colonials always kept one ear cocked in expectation that they would hear about cannibalism among the tribes of North America." End quote. And it seems Rivera, hearing these rumors, decided he didn't want to find out if that was the case. Rivera failed to find any mineral wealth on his expeditions. However, it did provide a description of the people and route that would become the Old Spanish Trail. The growth of California as a Spanish colony would spur the desire for growth in trade between New Mexico and California. Rivera explored before California had really been opened to the Spanish, which is why there was little follow-up when he didn't find much mineral wealth for potential colonies in the region. Mariners would visit California, and that was when the Spanish really started planning colonial possession. Fear of Russian encroachment was the final factor in establishing the colony, and in 1768, California was finally established. There was also a fear that people, namely the English, would discover the Strait of Anian, also known as the Northwest Passage, before the Spanish would. Stories of Europeans told by some of these local tribes made these fears the Spanish had worse. In 1769, the California colony would begin to be established, and by 1775 the colony had grown such that the Spanish were considering an overland connection between New Mexico and California. In 1781, Los Angeles, one terminus of the trail, would be established. The San Francisco Bay would eventually be linked to the myths of Gran Tagayo. From 1774 to 1776, Francisco Garces, who we talked about briefly on our episodes on Governor Juan Bautista de Anza, would explore as far east as the Hopi villages. mostly though he was exploring southern Arizona. He noted Pedro Fages, who had explored California's interior, had preceded him. Anza would lead an expedition from Tubac, near Tucson, for California in 1774, as we talked about in those episodes on Anza. It was thought that the Great Salt Lake was connected to the San Francisco Bay in some way. Garces may be the origin of this belief, but exactly who it comes from is a little unclear. Garces would also propose essentially the route that would be taken as the old Spanish Trail. He just needed someone to prove it. In 1776, Garces would try to blaze this trail. He would make it to the White River. He would continue on to approximately Bakersfield on the Kern River, and then continued east by southeast. He would explore a route to the Hopi Pueblos south of the Grand Canyon. He would see the Grand Canyon, being the first recorded to reach it from the west, and Garces would meet some Hopi traders in this area around the Grand Canyon. From here, Garces would travel to Arabe, and would get an offer to travel on to Zuni. He would decline this offer, though, so as not to trespass on another missionary field by actually entering into New Mexico. On July 3rd, 1776, Garces wrote a letter to the minister at Zuni, Fray Silvestre Velez de Escalante. Escalante already knew the route from Santa Fe to Arabe, and Garces would add the information to surpass the Grand Canyon. This gave the rudimentary form of the trail and future Route 66. Garces was the first to traverse the Mojave Desert and northern Arizona sections of the old Spanish Trail. Garces would eventually be killed in 1781 when the Yumas revolted against Spanish rule. But even then, at the end of the 1700s, the path was still a dream. In the 1800s, the Spanish would continue to settle the interior of California. These early expeditions would also reveal the land and people between California and New Mexico. In late July 1776, Frays Antanasio Dominguez and Silvestre Velez de Escalante prepared to leave Santa Fe on their expedition to Monterey, California. Among them was Juan Pedro Cisneros, chief magistrate of Zuni Pueblo, and others from across New Mexico. Andres Muniz had been with Rivera on his expedition and knew the Ute language. His brother, Lucrecio, understood and spoke the Utah language. Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco would be their cartographer. He would produce a map of the Hopi lands as a result of this expedition. There was a belief of a lost tribe of Spaniards somewhere between the Hopi and Monterey, California. From the Escalante journals regarding this belief, quote, from the misunderstood stories of the heathen Indians, many Spaniards were persuaded that on the other side of the Colorado River, with the Gila enters the Gulf of California, live a nation similar to the Spanish, wearing long beards, armor, like our ancient kind, with breastplate, iron helmet, and shoulder piece. And these, no doubt, are the bearded Utahs of whom Reverend Father Custodian Dominguez and I speak in this diary, of the journey which we made through those lands in the year 1776, who live in rancherias, not in pueblos. They are very poor. They use no arms other than their arrows and some lances of flint, nor have they any other breastplate, helmet, or shoulder piece than what they brought out from the belly of their mothers. End quote. Dominguez was the real leader of the expedition, and Escalante was the scribe, but both men collaborated to write the diary of the expedition. Escalante, being better known, may be why he gets so much credit towards the expedition. Escalante had arrived in New Mexico in 1774, and he quickly got a reputation as an explorer and missionary. The expedition went to Santa Clara, to Abiquiu, then to the Rio Chama. They followed the Navajo River to the San Juan, then proceeded southwest. Around this time they got lost, and ended up near Pagosa Springs. They continued to where the San Juan and Navajo River met. The expedition continued west towards Ignacio, Colorado, to the Florida River, and then the Rio de las Animas, not too far from Durango. They then continued on to the East Mancos River, then the main branch of the Mancos. They found some Pueblo ruins in this area, and then they continued near the Dolores River. Here they met two people who had left Abiquiu without permission and could have had problems with the Utes. They continued to the San Miguel River and had explored most of western Colorado at this point. They then continued to the Sierra de la Sal. There they met a Ute who agreed to take them to the Sabaguana. They moved to the Gunnison River, and then they had some difficulty, but eventually got a Sabugana to agree to lead them onwards. There they would be led on to meet the Utahs. Muniz and his brother had motivations to get the Sabuganas to convince the Spanish to turn back, as they had brought trade goods, something they were not supposed to have done. They crossed into Utah near the Green River. The expedition found some Pueblo ruins near the Duchenne River, and they crossed Diamond Creek. There they would meet two Lagunas who were initially hostile, but the Spanish guides intervened. They spent September exploring and discovering the Great Salt Lake. Near the end of September, they moved to explore near Provo, Utah. Around this time, they got caught in a bad snowstorm. They quickly realized that they may be better served finding a better route back to Santa Fe, Other members of the expedition were also beginning to complain, so overall they decided to draw lots. One group was to push on to Monterrey, and another to Cosnina, like Garces had done. If the former was chosen, Pacheco would be their leader. Cosnina would win the draw. By November, they were close to the Hopi Pueblos. They arrived in Santa Fe in January 1777. The Dominguez Escalante expedition, while not making it all the way to Monterrey, would establish the North Fork of the Old Spanish Trail. The Spanish would be sidetracked, though, by new hostilities with the nomadic tribes and expansion into Colorado, which caused the trail to be put on the back burner once again. In 1779, Teodoro de Croix gave Governor Anza a mission to bring the Hopi to heel and establish communications between California, Sonora, and Santa Fe. His first goal was to establish a route to the Colorado River. Enthusiasm had cooled for such a route over time, though, and the suggestion was to send Anza to rendezvous with Escalante at the Savagana Ute territory, and then to come back through the Navajo and Hopi territory to plan future conquests of these regions. But due to the conflict with the Comanches, culminating in the Comanche Peace we talked about, he was unable to do such an event. The Dominguez Escalante expedition had increased interest in trade in Utah territory, though. The Spanish prohibited trade as they were trying to stabilize relations, and Spanish traders weren't always necessarily the best behaved individuals. Unofficial expeditions still happened, though. Teodoro de Croix would ban the unofficial trade again in 1778 and try to enforce the ban across New Mexico. Genizarios and Native Americans were explicitly banned from carrying on such a trade. Punishment for participating anyway was imprisonment, fines of 100 pesos, which was a large sum for New Mexico at the time, or servitude. It also banned Spaniards from office and 100 lashes for Genizarios or Native Americans. Croix had it read aloud by crier and posted. People went to Utah country for a variety of reasons, from debt to recovering stolen animals or people. The latter option, often resulting in open warfare between the Spaniards and the people they encountered. New Mexican officials were also involved in the illicit trade. From explorers, traders, and slavers, quote, the bando did not address the complexity of the problem. It merely offered short-range penalties, which did not halt the proliferation of trade to the Utah country, end quote. Pedro Pino would suggest a route to the Pacific, and it might have been through Sonora. Slaves and goods were often exchanged by these illicit traders. Each expedition helped pave the routes that would become the Old Spanish Trail. After Mexican independence in 1821, the dream of connecting New Mexico to California was revived, and in 1829, Antonio Armijo would blaze the official trail from Abiquiu to Los Angeles. This would become the favored route. From explorers, traders, and slavers, quote, the eventual discovery of a practical route from New Mexico to California by Armijo was a culmination of decades of travel to the Utah country by New Mexican traders and slavers. They had learned about the geography and shared their knowledge. They learned the language of the Utes and used it for trade, and they accumulated information about the people and the land and passed it into the oral tradition of their generations. The Old Spanish Trail and its variant routes owed its existence as much to illegal traders as it did to those adventurers who sallied forth with license in hand and the blessing of Spanish authorities, end quote. In a less well-known addition to this trail as well, it also served as a migration route from New Mexico to California. Had Jose Maria Chavez, a supporter of Governor Perez, not fled along this route after the rebellion against the governor, an event we will talk about in future episodes, the use of the trail as a migration path may not have been noted. Chavez was born in Santa Clara in the early 1800s. His family dated back to at least the Reconquest period of New Mexico. A home of the Chavezes in Abiquiu would become the Georgia O'Keeffe House. Unlike many, he supported Mexican appointees. Mexicans generally opposed the centralists that ran the Mexican government in this period. Perez was a fine choice for governor. In 1835, he tried to regulate trade between New Mexico and the indigenous tribes, again trying to cut down on the raids. He also levied taxes, hoping to outfit New Mexicans to better fight off raids. It came to a head when one of Perez's men reversed a decision and imprisoned a judge. A mob soon formed and liberated the man for retreating to the mountains. This became the pretense for rebellion. While the plains had served as an obstacle to French, English, and Americans reaching New Mexico, by the early 1800s, many Americans were coming and trading in New Mexico. Santa Fe Trail had also added interest to trade with California. Hispanics living in Missouri helped establish connections between America and Santa Fe. After Mexican independence, Santa Fe soon became a jumping-off point for trade across the Southwest or deeper into Mexico. At least 5 major trapping expeditions would travel over the Old Spanish Trail between 1827 and 1830. Sometime in the 1820s to 1850s, slaves from Utah would be traded in California. These traders would trade their horses for slaves to sell in New Mexico on their return. Children were the preferred good for this slave trade. Eventually, Americans would get involved by raiding for these slaves instead of trading. This would create more violence in Utah and New Mexico. In the 1850s, Utah's legislature would declare, quote, "Whereas it is common practice among these Indians to gamble away their own children and women, and it is a well-established fact that women and children thus obtained or frequently carried from place to place, packed upon horse or mules, lariated out to subsist upon grass, roots, or starve, and are frequently bound with thongs made of rawhide, till their hands and feet become swollen, mutilated, inflamed with pain and wounded, and when, with suffering, cold, hunger, and abuse, they fall sick so as to become troublesome, are frequently slain by their masters to get rid of them, and whereas they do frequently kill their women and children, taken prisoners, either for revenge or for amusement, or through the influence of tradition, unless they are tempted to exchange them for trade, which they usually do, if they have an opportunity, and whereas one family frequently steals the children and women of another family, when such robberies and murders are continually committed in times of their greatest peace and amity, thus dragging free Indian women and children into Mexican servitude and slavery or death, to the almost entire extirpation of the whole Indian race, and whereas these inhuman practices are being daily enacted before our eyes, it becomes the duty of all humane and Christian people to extend unto this degraded and downtrodden race such a relief as can be awarded to them, according to their situation and circumstances. The solution the Utah legislature saw was to drive out the New Mexican slavers, ban Americans from participating in the trade, and educate the Native Americans about how this is wrong. The laws passed simply replaced the New Mexican slavers, though, with Mormon slavers. It did not solve the actual underlying problem of the slave trade. After 1841, the route became more for immigration instead of trade. Anti-Mexican sentiment had driven New Mexican traders from Utah almost entirely. Mormon settlement in the Mexican-American War helped end the New Mexican dominance of the trade. Pedro Leon led one last major expedition in 1851. From this point onward, trade began to diminish. In 1853, after continued conflicts between Mormons and New Mexicans, Brigham Young declared that New Mexicans were no longer welcome in Utah territory. One last note on the trail from explorers, traders, and slavers. Quote, "It is part of our national story, with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro and the Santa Fe Chihuahua Trail. The old Spanish Trail has a special place in making New Mexico the heartland of the Southwest, where once upon a time, all roads led to Santa Fe." End quote. Now, I know in the past few episodes I've been mentioning that I only have a couple more episodes left before the end of the Spanish period and the next Q&A episode, but I've actually lied and cheated you. I forgot about the October episodes, so in reality I probably have about 6 more episodes between this one and the Spanish colonial Q&A. So if you have any questions, please get them in via either our website, engineeringfire.org, or the show's email, michael@engineeringfire.org. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.